Now, in the next chapter, we're going to look at integration between After Effects and other Adobe products. But because there is an extra special relationship between After Effects and Photoshop, think of them as like their first love. There's such a great relationship between the two programs that I want to take an entire chapter devoted just to the relationship between After Effects and Photoshop. Now, when I teach in the classroom, all the time people ask me, is it possible to be good at After Effects and not know Photoshop? The answer is, of course you can. But folks, what I'm here to tell you is that you will be so much better of an animator in After Effects if you are proficient in Photoshop. Now, throughout this chapter, I'm going to show you a bunch of tips and tricks, etc., but my real underlying message in this chapter is not just how to do these little tricks, but that you should learn Photoshop and get proficient with it. Now, fortunate for you, you are using lynda.com, which has one of the most prolific collections of Photoshop training anywhere. There's hundreds of hours of Photoshop training to get you up to speed. Okay, so this first movie in this chapter, we're going to look at how to bring in Photoshop files. When we import movies or audio or still images, it's basically just one click. You double click in the project panel, you import, you just bring it in. It's no big deal. But when you're bringing in a Photoshop file, there's actually a whole heck of a lot more to it. I'm going to start here in Photoshop with this PSD import test. And of course, you'll find this in the Chapter 18 folder. PSD is the native file format for a Photoshop document. Now, when you're using Photoshop, you can output to like a JPEG or a still image or whatever, even a movie file format if you want to. But in order to get all the power of using Photoshop and After Effects together, you need to be saving to the standard default Photoshop document when in Photoshop. In the next segment, I'm going to talk about all the stuff that Photoshop carries over into After Effects that After Effects can recognize. But we're not there yet. Let's finish talking about importing here. We have this little image, and I have all these different layers here. As you can see, as I take off the visibility of these different layers, again, the eye icon, just like After Effects. Layers are stacked just like in After Effects, and layers on top obscure the view of those beneath them, just like in After Effects. So the window is on top of the house, but if I were to drag it beneath the house, then it would look like this, and the window would be obscured by the view of the house. I'm just going to hit Control-Z, again, just like in After Effects to undo that. Mac users hit Command-Z. And so this is our cool little house. Now let's go over into After Effects and figure out how to bring this sucker in. What I'm going to do here is double-click in the project panel, and I'm going to navigate to the Chapter 18 folder. I'm going to click once on the PSD import test.psd file. Now this is important, folks. We have 3 new options here. When it says import as footage, for most objects that you bring into After Effects, it just says import as footage, and you can't change it. Nothing you can do about it. No options there. But when you bring in a Photoshop document, there are several options. Now, if we select footage here, it's going to actually open up another dialog box, so we're not done yet. So I'm going to skip over that, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. If I select composition, then you will see the magic of After Effects in Photoshop. So what this will do is it will bring in your Photoshop document with all the layers intact in the same stacking order into a composition that After Effects makes itself upon import. So you might be wondering now, what's the difference between composition cropped layers and composition? Here's the difference. If you bring this Photoshop document in as a composition, it will bring in every layer at the size of the entire document. So let's say, for example, since we're in this import file dialog box, that this file dialog box represented the Photoshop document size. Well, this little icon right here is very small. If we bring this in as a composition, then this little layer will be seen as big as the entire document. The anchor point will be in the center of the entire document for every single layer. If we were to select composition cropped layers, what that would do is bring in every layer at the size of the layer, not the document. So this little icon would be about the size of the icon, and the anchor point would be in the center of the icon, not in the center of the entire document. And we are actually going to import this as a composition momentarily, but first I want to show you the footage dialog box. So I'm going to select footage and click open. Now again, we have this dialog box that pops up. If you would like to select composition or composition crop layers, you can still do this from the import kind dropdown. We'll come back to these in a second. I'm going to select footage. And if we select footage, what we can do is select merge layers. What that will do is smush all of your Photoshop layers into a still image, essentially. So let's say you're doing some really fine detailed artwork and every layer has a bunch of different brush strokes. Well, when you're done and you want to bring it into After Effects, maybe you want that to be one solid image. You don't want all those little pieces on all those separate layers. So you could select to merge the layers and After Effects will just kind of compress it and see it as one layer. In other words, it'll be just kind of like you export it from Photoshop as an image file. Merged layers is also good if you have a problem when you're bringing stuff over from Photoshop into After Effects and the appearance changes a little bit. Merged layers does a pretty good job of maintaining the appearance. Now you could also select Choose Layer and you could pick any layer to bring in. This is extremely convenient. Let's say you want to use in your After Effects composition here a layer from a Photoshop document from years ago. You don't want to bring in the whole dang file, you just want one specific layer. So you could select Choose Layer and we could bring in just the house or just the roof. Also notice, folks, that there's a layer called Unnamed Layer. Now, when you make a new layer in Photoshop, an unnamed layer really has the name of Layer 1, Layer 2, or whatever. So I intentionally called this Unnamed Layer so that you would see how important it is to name your layers in Photoshop before bringing them over here into After Effects. When you are in Photoshop, you have a layer thumbnail. In other words, you have a little picture that gives you a representation of what you're seeing in the document. In After Effects, you have no such thing, either here in the dropdown or here in the timeline panel. So it's very important that you name your layers well in Photoshop. I have no idea what the contents of this layer is from this dropdown, and I won't have any idea once I bring it into my timeline once it's imported either. So again, set up your files well in Photoshop. Now I'm going to go back here, and new to CS3, there are two options here, and they both deal with layer styles from Photoshop. We can merge layer styles into footage, or we can ignore the layer styles. Now, there are much less compatibility issues in After Effects CS3 when you bring in Photoshop layer styles because layer styles, as we'll see later in this chapter, are now here natively in After Effects as well. If you're having a problem, you can set this to ignore layer styles. Or if you just don't want layer styles on your objects that you're bringing over, you could just select ignore layer styles and add them here in After Effects. Now, notice this footage dimension dropdown. It gives us two choices here, layer size and document size. This is the same thing as composition and composition cropped layers, except it's a little easier to figure out. Now, we actually want to import this as a composition, so I'm going to actually change import kind to composition cropped layers. Now, we have two choices here, editable layer styles. If we select this option, what After Effects is going to do is allow us to edit those layer styles. If we select merge layer styles into footage, then it will basically compress those layer styles so that we cannot play around with them. It's almost like baking the styles into the footage itself. And as it says here, merge layer styles into footage renders faster and allows for 3D intersection. And it renders faster because it doesn't have to calculate the style, it's already merged into the layer. It also gives you a warning here, it may not match Photoshop exactly. But it does allow for 3D intersections, whereas editable layer styles does not. But we don't really have any layer styles to worry about in this Photoshop document, so I'm just going to click OK with any option. And because I clicked composition when I brought this in, I selected to bring this in as a composition with cropped layers. It did two things for me essentially. It made me a folder and a composition. In the folder, we have all the different layers. So if we want to reuse some of these layers later, we can totally do that. We also have this composition that has all of these pieces, the layers, arranged in order. Think of it kind of like an HTML document where this has the master instructions for how to assemble these layers. So I'm going to double click this composition to open it up. And again, we see all of our layers here. Everything looks exactly the way it did in Photoshop. We take off the visibility of these different layers, grass or dirt. And you can see it's the same control we have in Photoshop, except now we could animate this and really bring this to life in a much easier way than we can in even Photoshop Extended. And again, because we imported this as a composition, it made this folder for us with all the layers. So if we wanted to add more stars or smoke or whatever, let's say we wanted to drag some more smoke from the chimney over, there's some more smoke and we could bring that over and add a little bit more depth to that smoke if we wanted to. So you can see just the amazing flexibility when you're bringing Photoshop stuff over into After Effects. It's not just a standard image file format. So now you probably have the question in your mind, well, what does After Effects recognize when coming over from Photoshop to After Effects? And that's what we're going to talk about next. I've created a little file for you, a little chart that will show you all the stuff that After Effects will recognize from Photoshop.